Of her famous Little House on the Prairie novels, Laura Ingalls Wilder was quoted as saying that they were the truth, but not all the truth. There was much about American life on the frontier during the 1870s and 1880s that Laura simply didn't address in detail.
She was writing from her perspective. She was writing from her time. She was writing fiction largely built upon experiences that she had seen in her own life. Doesn't mean that everyone thought this way. Doesn't mean that everyone lived their lives this way. It's just a part of the puzzle. I think what's important, though, is if you want to have a look into what life was like at that time, Laura Ingalls Wilder is one person whom you can read. There are other sources that you need to look at, however, to see what was going on in the lives of Native Americans and African Americans, because they were there.
As Laura was coming of age, there was a great migration out of the South of African Americans who moved out of the South into Kansas. And they chose Kansas in particular because they thought that this was going to be a sort of promised land, a new Canaan, if you will. That's the kind of language that they used. Kansas has a long history of professing to be the quintessential free state, and it has professed to promote a kind of equality that didn't exist in other parts of the country.
The idea of movement is very, very important within the African American community, to move away from the old slavery past, the old restrictions, to create something new. Between 1870 and 1880, you have the influx of about 40,000 people coming to the Kansas region, which is a huge influx of people. But everything is not wonderful for them, and blacks are discriminated against. They are prevented from doing certain things. They are segregated in certain areas.
In the Little House books, they're very open to people of African American backgrounds, of Native American backgrounds, but I think what Laura Ingalls Wilder as a writer might have missed were these larger issues of racial prejudice that existed not only on the frontier but in the North and the South as well.
One, I'm never one to criticize an author for a historic piece, for what they did or did not put in. I always teach to people that for a book, you have to accept it for what it's there, teach the book from what it is, and then expand upon it as much as possible.
We tend to think of Native Americans or Indians as being this one monolithic group that just thought the same and operated the same, and that was not the case. They were different groups, different tribal groups with different beliefs, sometimes different systems, and they would fight amongst each other. They did not like each other sometimes. So, I mean, into this mix, then you throw African Americans and you throw whites, which were not all white at the time. They looked at each other being different in terms of being of Irish background or German background or, Norwegian or whatever. And I mean, there was, it's not as cut and dry, or definitely not as black and white as we tend to look at it.
The Osage Indians figured prominently in Laura's third novel, Little House on the Prairie.
Well, the Osage during French colonization learned how to use the resources of the plains and the prairies and the other environments that come together in Missouri in order to develop themselves as middlemen in the trade between the French and further western tribes. The Osage were well versed at this and very successful at it. They developed the largest trading empire, some say in North America, in the 1700s. They made sure to be on good terms with the United States throughout their tribal history. They never went to war against the United States or the U.S. Army. They believed that this would be a great way to preserve people, land, and hopefully some measure of sovereignty, and that certainly was the case.
In By the Shores of Silver Lake, Laura writes about Big Jerry, a member of the Lakota tribe.
One of the things about Big Jerry and Soledad Deschênes as sort of characters in Laura's story is they actually exemplify something that both happened in the 19th century that we rarely recognize and something that we rarely recognize even now in studying Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples had an incredible capacity to coexist with their white neighbors. Now, this is frequently not characterized, but Native peoples all over North America learned how to farm in ways that were more economical and successful financially and amongst their white neighbors. They learned how to raise livestock in ways that coexisted with their white neighbors, and they learned to speak languages of French, Spanish, English, or American counterparts all around them. Many Native peoples intermarried with a lot of their surrounding white populations. And they learned to do this because Native culture is culturally built to adapt to many different circumstances.
If we compare Charles and Caroline's attitudes about Native Americans, what we see is that Charles had a lot more opportunities to engage with Native Americans. He was the one who was able to go hunting with them. He was the one who was often trading in a market or even in informal trades with them. Whereas Caroline, I think, had fewer opportunities to engage with them on a day-to-day level.
Although I think it is not the center of her text, I think that Laura does provide a very subtle critique and question, particularly in terms of Indian policy in several places where she discusses it. In several places she asks her mother, why do you not like or why do you dislike Indians? And her mother has varying answers. But Laura's questioning of this and retelling of this questioning is unusual in terms of texts and literature about Indian policy. She also talks to her father about government policy and aren't we living in Indian territory? Doesn't this belong to Native peoples? Why are we expecting that they will move? And I mean, these are somewhat quiet critiques of why is it that Indian territory is a place that must be extinguished. And I think in classrooms that discuss this text, these would be great conversation pieces for students.
If you're a young person and you've read part or all of the Wilder series, and you're like, wow, I'm really into this, I really want to know more about what was going on in the Prairie during the 1870s and 1880s, you're blessed, because today we have the World Wide Web. You go to the internet and you go to social historical sites and you start looking at links on different areas, different groups, different tribes, different nations who were living there, different immigrant groups, and you just start expanding your knowledge. All you have to do is just keep asking yourself, why? Who were these people? The answers are out there. You just have to look.